Rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum. So we're going to take two and go on. It's not quite an encore, but it's news stories that maybe many of you who've come to past gatherings have heard some of these stories before, but many of you particularly from Sweden, haven't. And anyway, it doesn't matter because these stories they refresh themselves. You know, they're the kind of stories that when you hear, you may see it and hear it in a way for the first time. So I wanted to touch today on the theme of the movie that we watched last night, on Blessed Are the Strangers. So it took me back to my time at the Darqawi Institute in the Ihsan Mosque with the community in Norwich. I spent 1 year with them there and had some amazing experiences there. Experiences that you can only, in the end, arrive at the conclusion that we are not in charge of anything, that Allah is in charge, that anything that you think that you're planning and doing, it may come about, but certainly, normally it comes about the way Allah Azza wa Jal wants it to happen. So I'm going to tell you some stories about that era. I'm going to begin with how I got to England in the first place, because I think that sort of set the theme to joining up with Sheikh Abdul Qadir's community. So I was in Atlanta, Georgia. We had a community in Tucson, Arizona, and it was a thriving community, a Sufi community around Sheikh Abdul Qadir. And people were starting to get their businesses together, and we had dhikr constantly, nearly every day, often before Fajr. And we had people going out to the campus at University of Arizona under Sheikh Abdul Qadir's direction, and to do the salat right on the quad, so that the students would see us praying. You know, there's something so transmitative and visceral by seeing somebody do sajda that it affects the people who are stirring in a way, and it happened. We used to go out there and pray, and people would either throw popcorn at us or come around and ask us what we're doing. And eventually we had nearly a dozen people from the campus embrace Islam from that. But anyway, that Sheikh Abdul Qadir broke that up. In the height of this sort of development, this was his pattern. We had this whole community development, and we had businesses and so on. And then he came one day and said, you know, the Sufi doesn't become attached to anything. And he said, the caravan moves on. And he said, we're all moving to Atlanta. There's a community there that we're going to move in with, and we're all going to be out of here within 7 days. And so the entire community of people just broke apart, and we moved to Atlanta. In Atlanta, I was invited by Sheikh Abdul Qadir to come to England and to become the administrator of the Darqawi Institute, right? And I was planning, I got a job working there, and I had my ticket ready to go from Atlanta to London. And Sheikh Abdul Qadir called me on the phone, and he said, I'd like very much that you would come, but can you bring this young man by the name of Tiku Noor with you, right, to England? Now, he was an Aboriginal Indian who had embraced Islam. He was in Arizona at the time he met Sheikh Abdul Qadir, and he was part of sort of a Hopi Indian excursion that Sheikh Abdul Qadir visited the Hopi Indians. And that's another story I'll get into another time with you. That in itself was an extraordinary moment, really in the history of the Hopi Indians, but we'll take that up another time. So I said to Sheikh Abdul Qadir, yes, of course, I would do it. So I took my ticket and I traded it in from a regular ticket to 2 standby tickets. So the day that we were leaving, we went from Atlanta to Washington, D.C., and as soon as we arrived, we heard an announcement on the PA that all of I think it was the L-1011s, or there's another aircraft, I'm not quite sure now which one it was, the entire Atlantic fleet was grounded because there were three crashes within a 5-week period of this particular aircraft that was the main aircraft that traveled from the east coast of the United States to London and Paris, etc. So here we are at the airport with 2 standby tickets, and all the airplanes are grounded except for the 747s. And already people had bought their tickets, and there was no way we were going to get on a flight. And both of us were completely broke. I had just embraced Islam, maybe I was a Muslim for a year. My family had totally disowned me. They were trying to get me to come back to California and institutionalize me for becoming a Muslim. And the young man who was with me came off of a reservation and he had nothing. So we wound up actually living in the airport for about 3 days. And we got into sort of a routine. Every night we would go to the agent counter, and there was this young man. He'd see us coming, and he would just go, "You're not getting on tonight." And he said, "If you're going to upgrade your ticket and pay the upgrade, we can get you on the aircraft. But otherwise, no, we're not going to. You can't get on. We don't have the room." So we had some Mexican restaurants that we sort of hooked onto, who at night gave us food to eat, and we showered in the bathrooms. Somebody would watch the door and make sure nobody comes in. And we were there literally 3 days, every night going to the counter, and every night hearing this guy look at us and say, "You're not getting on." And I felt very positive. I was ready to stay for some days in that airport, because I just felt like something was going to give, and I didn't know quite how that was going to happen. So I think it was the 3rd or the 4th day. I was walking, sort of now my daily routine, getting exercise in the terminals. I'm walking through and I come upon the Concorde Lounge. And in those days they had this, you must know about the Concorde, a supersonic jet, 3 hours to London and so on. And they would have this drama take place where the people who would be disembarking, I guess is the word, disembarking the plane, they would have a red carpet, and then these little lights would go off. And I thought it was this incredible spectacle, so I just sat and watched it, and watching the people come off, and all of a sudden I see Sheikh Fadlallah coming off the plane, right? And I went, wow, subhanAllah, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for. And I knew him as, of course, we used to call him in those days Sidi Fadlallah. We knew him as sort of, this rich businessman who was learning his deen, and he was, and he was a student of Sheikh Abdul Qadir, who we appeared to take a sort of a special liking to him, and we didn't understand more why, but there he was, and I said, well, that's it. I'm going to tell him the whole story, and he's going to reach into his big pocket, and he's going to, give me enough money to pay for our tickets. I felt really confident about that. He's a very generous person, he was. So he looked at me, he said, "MashaAllah, Mustafa," and I go, "Fadlallah," and we hugged, and he said, "MashaAllah, what are you doing here?" And I explained the whole thing to him. I said, "This happened, and this happened, and we just need to upgrade our ticket." And he just said, "Subhanallah," and he reached in his pocket, and I said, "Well, here it comes." He reached in his pocket, and what he came out with was this very cheap, mangled tasbih made out of plastic, and he puts it in my hand. He says, "Say Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakeel, everything will be all right, Assalamu alaikum," and he walked away. Didn't go over well, I said, "Really? Really?" It was, "Show me the money." "Show me the money, what's this?" Well, I was a bit more serious. So I said, "Okay, all right." At first I was not happy and disappointed, etc. But I said, "Look, what do I have to lose, right? I know what Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel means. It was the perfect thing for me to say at the moment." So I took the tasbih and I started to say Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. And I'm walking around the airport saying that, and the time came for the evening flights for London, and there was the same guy, right, sitting at the counter. And we were walking up to him, and again he's shaking his head, "No, no, 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 no." as I grew closer to him, I saw him eyeing my tasbih, this little mangled sort of plastic tasbih made in Japan or something. And in those days, made in Japan was cheap. Now, that'd be made in China, of course. But he looked at it and he said, "What's that?" Right? And I thought, "Oh no, I'm gonna have to explain to him what this is." I didn't have the patience for it, and I said, "It's a rosary, right?" And then he said, "No, it's not a rosary." And then I knew, okay, something is happening here. So I walked up to him and he said, "That's a tasbih." I said, "Yeah." I said, "How do you know that?" And he said, "You see my name?" And he had a name tag. It was Alan. But he said, "My real name is Ali," right? And then he said something very strange. He said, "I'm a secret Muslim working for Pan Am." I mean, okay. And he said, "What are you saying on your tasbih?" I said, "Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakeel." He said, "Who told you that?" I said, "Well," this man told me to say that. And he said, "Why are you going to England?" And I said, "I'm going there because my sheikh asked me to come. I'm a new Muslim. I'm coming there to learn my deen, to learn what Islam is all about." And he started to weep. And it was just a very moving moment between us. He said, "Okay." He said, "Where's your friend?" And I brought Tiku Noor up. He said, "Give me your bags." We immediately took our bags. He took our tickets. And in those days, they used to have these little stickers. They pull them off and pull them on. He puts new stickers on our standby ticket. And he says, "Come with me." And he had another agent take care of the desk. He brought us onto the plane. He put us on first class on a 747 airplane. And we were within 5 minutes, we were sitting on the first class compartment, and Tiku Noor and I were looking at each other, Allahu Akbar, and I said, and that was the beginning of this journey to go to visit Sheikh Abdul Qadir was in this way. And I remember Ali came on the plane just as we were taking off, and I was a bit concerned about him, thinking, he may get in trouble. How is he going to justify this? So I said to him, "Aren't you going to get in trouble for doing this?" And he looked at me and he said, "Hasbunallahu wa ni'mal wakeel." It was so beautiful, and I never saw him again, but that was our journey to arriving in England. Now, when in England, can you give me a little napkin too, because I'm sweating here, something to wipe my head. So we get to England, and I was immediately I was told that I would be the administrator of the Darqawi Institute. Now, what Sheikh Abdul Qadir didn't realize is what was in that film last night, is that the fuqara didn't tell Sheikh Abdul Qadir that they had taken all the wood panels out of every floor of the Darqawi Institute and burned them for fuel. And the only room was left was a tiny little room up a wooden staircase at the top of a Tudor mansion in the middle of winter, and with a fireplace with no wood, and that's where I was dropped off. And I stayed there, and I won't go too much into that because that was another saga that'll take me time to go through, but I wound up staying there several months. That's where my hair kind of grew out, and I found a box of henna, and I remembered a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he said that if you put henna on your hair, it's a cure for melancholy. Well, it worked. My hair was bright red. And I looked in the mirror and it looked good and I was happy. But I stayed there a little bit too long, and it was... Anyway, when I left there, I wound up living at the Ihsan Mosque. They said, we don't have any really room anywhere else for you, so why don't you just sleep in the mosque? So I wound up living in the mosque for about 3 months. And I lived in the back. There was a school for children, and there were benches. And at night, I converted those benches into a bed with some cloth and things like that, and stayed there and just kept the mosque swept and cleaned and all that. And that was my job, to just keep it well. Anyway, many things happened there, which I'll go into that another time. Also, I want to get to the core of the story I want to tell. So after some time, I started, I think it was toward the end of my journey in Norwich, I could see that the Norwich community was dysfunctional. And there was no way that they could reconcile the sort of the directions of the sheikh with the wants and the desires of everyday life of the community. Sheikh Abdul Qadir, you know, was always aloof and in his home, and he sort of left the everyday activity to his emirs and to people who were the leaders of the community, and there was a disconnect. And it came to a point where the community there came up with a social model to live by that I just felt was totally psychopathic. So I just said, I'm leaving. I started to pray that I wanted to get out of there and find a way to go. So every day I prayed that I would find a way out. One day, now this is what, I'm starting the story, and there's a couple elements I want you to keep in mind while I tell this story. So remember that I got to this point where I wanted to leave. Now I'm going to roll back this film about 6 months. I'm in Birmingham, in England, and which is a very predominantly, there's a Pakistani Indian community there. And there's a Sufi sheikh there called Sufi Abdullah. And every year he has an urs, he's a Chishti, and every year they have an urs for their sheikh. Well, they were having this big urs, and they form a huge circle in a big open grass area. And people would be doing dhikr, and food was being passed around, and there was charity being given out, and there was so many activities. It was a wonderful celebration of their grand sheikh. Well, I was sitting in that circle and looking straight ahead of me at the very directly across from me, which was now about 100 meters, really. It's a long, long way. I saw this man, he was about this big in my eyes, and he was sitting there with his hands like this. And he kept looking over his hands at me. I could tell he was looking like me, and then covering. And then looking at me again. I kind of waved it, and he waved back, and I remember his face, and it was this beautiful, Indian man with a long black beard and a beautiful turban, and lovely. And I was thinking after the dhikr, I want to go try to find him. Well, after the dhikr, I couldn't find him. There were hundreds of people, and I couldn't find him. Okay, keep that story in mind for a moment. Now, I'm back in the mosque, praying to get out. One Jummah, we're finished the Jummah, and this Egyptian man, who I saw every Jummah, come over to me at the end of the Jummah, and he hugged me and said, thank you very much for looking after the mosque, and mashallah, it's been wonderful to know you. I'm leaving back to my country. And he starts to put his hand in my pocket, right? Now, I didn't have anything in there anyway, but my first reaction was like, what are you doing, And he starts putting his hand there, and he looked at me, he said, don't look in your pocket till I leave, right? So I said, all right, and he moved away from me, he went out of the mosque, and then I put my hand in the pocket, and it was a roll of 50-pound notes. There was 750 quid in my pocket. Now in 1977, that was a lot of money, and that was my way out. So I had this money because I couldn't work while I was there. I lived up the Cadbury chocolate factory while I was there. I had this money, and I immediately went to the train station. I knew I was going to go to London to buy my ticket, but I didn't know where to go. So I called Sheikh Abdul Qadir on the phone. I said, I'm leaving. I said, there's nothing you can say that will stop me. I said, all I want is one last piece of advice from you, is that where should I go? And first he tried to talk me out of it, but I just said, I'm leaving. Because I saw no future there for myself. So he said, go to City Fadlallah, right? That was his. So I said, okay. When I went to London, I got my ticket. I also got new clothes, because I had only old clothes. And I got new clothes, and I got a ticket, and I went to San Antonio, Texas, where Sheikh Fadlallah at that time still was City Fadlallah, and he had a project to build this madrasa, but there was a zawiya there of Sheikh Abdul Qadir's, and many of the fuqara of Sheikh Abdul Qadir was there. So it was a kind of a mixed kind of situation. There were Sheikh Fadlallah's, a few people around him, friends, and then there was Sheikh Abdul Qadir's people, and all of that. So I became blended into that community for a while. Now, I want to roll this thing up about 4 or 5 years, right? So we're at about, we're about 80, maybe 80, 1980, something like that, 79, 80, 81, something like that. A friend of mine, Hajj Ahmed, maybe some of you know him, we decided that we were going to go on Umrah to Saudi Arabia. So we were on our way to Saudi Arabia, and we landed in Jeddah, and we were on a bus from Jeddah to Medina. On the bus, while we were there, it was full of people in the night. I felt this breathing down my neck, and there was a man breathing down my neck, right? And he kept coming close to me and tickling my back with his beard, you know. And I kept turning around, I saw half of his face. I just looked at him, and I didn't know who he was, but he kept coming back, And then finally, he leaps over the seat, because there was people in the aisleway. He leaps over the seat, and he leaps into my lap. And he's crying, and he's grabbing me, And I'm looking at him, and I'm saying, what's wrong? What's going what's happening? Why are you upset? I'm trying to do it half in Pidgin Arabic and English. And then he says, you don't know who I am. And I said, I don't know who I am. I said, well, what do you mean? I said, and then I realized this was the face that was in the circle in that dhikr. That when and he said, I'm the guy, this guy, I said, yeah. And he said, you know what my dua was? I said, no. He says, my dua that day, 4 or 5 years ago, was that when I saw you, I saw this fresh new Muslim, I asked Allah that I would meet you at the Rawdah of the Prophet ﷺ. And here we were on our way together in that bus to the Rawdah of the Prophet ﷺ. How do you, so we start up a wonderful conversation, and it was tremendous. And we get to Medina, and I told him, look, we don't know where we're going to stay. He says, don't worry. He says, I have a good friend in Medina. He'll take care of us. So we arrive at the bus station in Medina, and it was night. Again, it was probably 2 a.m. or something. And we saw this a big Mercedes kind of rolled up, and I said, wow, that's really nice, And he got out of the bus. He says, my friend is here to pick us up. So we got out of the bus and went to the car, and then the car door opened, the driver, it was the Egyptian guy. He had given me the money. Allahu Akbar. And here we were, like, with this man and this man at the Prophet's, and we went right to the Prophet's mosque. All of us were completely shattered from that, because we shared notes. We said, how can this happen? So this is the type of thing, is that you never know where, what, how, when. If you're really on everyone is of course on a path. Everyone is reading the moment. There's a special, I believe, dynamic, is that when your intention is to know more about who you are, why you're here, what your life is about, you magnetize a certain and project. It's a mystery on how it all happens, but something else takes place. Allah's order and His angels and His helpers come into play in a way that you just have no idea that it's going to happen. So that is exactly what happened in that. So I wanted to share that with you today. How much time do I have left? Okay. So I want to share one more story with you. This is about Sheikh Abdul Qadir. When we established our center in Tucson, we had a place on a main road called Speedway, and we had a zawiya there where we had dhikr and gathering. And I had at that point, when I left my previous life and embraced Islam, I had a little bit of money, so I bought a really nice car. I had what did I have? I had a Pontiac Delta 88 or something like it. Was a big 8-cylinder, like Sheikh Fadlullah mentioned, these 20-foot cars. I had this massive 1976, Delta 88 green, to match the green turbans of the Darkawi, and nice leather, because I knew if I had a really nice car, I could drive Sheikh Abdul Qadir around, right? And I did. So whenever he came to Tucson, he said, "Is that your car?" I said, "Yes." Yeah. And so I get to drive him around and listen to him while he, is in the car and hear his words of wisdom. But it came a point in Tucson where my funds ran out, and in those days we had a very a situation where the muqaddam of Sheikh Abdul Qadir would sort of control who would work, who would not work, and so a few of us had to work, and we had to support the rest of the community. And I was one of those who worked. I started selling water beds, which was really something extraordinary. I'd never done anything like that before. But I ran out of funds, and so I had to sell my car. So I sold the car, and I bought a little red Datsun, sort of like, it was just the most tiniest little car, and it was a mess too. It was old, but it's what I could afford. And then I heard that Sheikh Abdul Qadir was coming to town sometime. He never really kind of gave us an announcement when he was going to come. So I thought to myself, I need to get a good car. Maybe I can. So I had this imagination about that if I go to a Cadillac dealer, I could maybe make a deal with them, pay them, And so I went to the Cadillac dealership, right? And I saw this green Fleetwood, right? It's an elongated Cadillac with a kind of like a limousine style in the back, And so I told the manager, I said, I'd like to take it for a test drive, right? He said, go right ahead. He said, let me have your license. And he took a copy of my license. And I took the car out and I went for a test drive. So I'm driving around. I said, wow, this would be the car to drive Sheikh Abdul Qadir around. All of a sudden, I get this feeling that Sheikh Abdul Qadir's arrived. That, I was overwhelmed by this idea that he was at the Zawiya and that I should run there immediately. And so I did. So I took the car and I went to the Zawiya. Lo and behold, he's standing there in the driveway with his suitcases. Nobody there except me and him. And I pulled up the Cadillac and I opened the door and I opened the back door of the Cadillac. I said, Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Abdul Qadir. Come, let's go. And he said, SubhanAllah, this is a beautiful car. I said, yeah, it's lovely. And then he says, is it yours? I said, yeah, it's That was bad. And so he got in the back of the car, and I was thinking to myself, no, what have I done now? And he says, he's going to his house. So I knew his house was about 15 miles away. I'd already had the Cadillac now for about an hour and a half. I should have been back in 10 minutes. I'm sure there's a police are after me, stolen car. And I'm thinking, now I've really done it, because if I get arrested, Sheikh Abdul Qadir will be arrested too, It was a mess. So I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to drop him at his house, and then I'm going to go back to the dealership, and I'm just going to say, I'm really sorry, I don't know, I'll try to make up some excuse. So I take him to his house, and he gets out of the car, we unload his baggage, and then he says, come in for a cup of tea, right? I can't refuse him because, so I came in for a cup of tea, and then it was, let's pray Maghrib together. Right? And then it was, can you cook me some dinner? And please stay overnight, I don't want to be here by myself. So I wound up staying overnight with a stolen car, with Sheikh Abdul Qadir. Terrible. So the next day, Sheikh Abdul Qadir comes out of his room and he says, Hajj Mustafa, he said, let's go shopping, right? So I said, and I tried to make some excuse to him, but he just, he dismissed it. You know what I was saying? And so we went shopping. We went to the mall. We went around, and I am like on pins and needles. And he kept asking me, "Are you all right?" And my heart's going, and I'm going, "Yeah, I'm all right." And I'm just completely in such a state. And I'm looking in the rearview mirror for a police car. I'm paranoid to the hilt. And he's just enjoying himself, listening to classical music, and we had a wonderful day out shopping, and he did at least. And then he said, "Can you take me home?" And I said, "Yes, I'll take you home." And then he said, "Tonight we're going to have a dhikr at the Zawiya." So he said, "Stay here and wait. We'll call the people and tell them to all gather, and we'll come for a dhikr." So that was the second night that I've had this car. And we go into town, which is 15 miles away, and we get to the house where the dhikr is, and I can hear the dhikr from the street. It was wonderful, sorry. It was, hey, 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 and you could see the whole house with the lights flickering, and Sheikh Wakar rushes inside with me. We rush inside, and we jump. He jumps into the middle of the circle, and it's an intense moment in the room. And I find my place in the circle, and I hold hands with the two men next to me, and we immediately enter into the performance of the dhikr, and then you're not supposed to look up and look at each other. You're supposed to keep your eyes focused down or slightly closed, and then focusing on your heart. So I was doing that. But I wandered a little bit, and I look up, right, and to my horror, across this little circle of dhikr is the manager of the Cadillac dealership in the dhikr, in the hadra. And we're both looking at each other. Hey, hey, hey. It was maddening. Allahu Akbar. I just said, "What?" And he's looking at me with "I'm going to kill you." It was terrible. But I thought, but why is he here? How could he be here? So the dhikr ends, everybody sits down, and Sheikh Abdul Qadir gives a talk. And it was one of those, a very scintillating, highly enlightening, talks that you all know the taste of. And he finished his talk, and of course, I very shyly walked around to where this guy was. He actually was walking towards me, and he looked at me and says, "Where's my car?" And I'm saying, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "I put a police report on you." I said, "But I'll stop it." I said, "Well, that's nice of you." I said, and then he tells me, it turns out that he's a Muslim, right? And he said, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you call me?" He was really upset with me. But he was so moved by the talk that Sheikh Abdul Qadir gave, right? And he just forgave me right there. He just said, "Okay." He said, he said something. He actually called me a few names before that, and explained to me how I could be in jail right now, and I understood that. And I gave him back the keys, and I said, "Really, thank you very much." And then I pushed it a little bit. I said, "Well, now that you've heard the sheikh, why don't you give me the car, right?" He said, "No," right? And I gave him back the car, and I had parked my red Datsun in the driveway of this Zawiya, so it was there. So when Sheikh Abdul Qadir came out after the dhikr, I rolled my car out in the street, and there was this little red Datsun. I opened the door for him, and he looked at it, and he didn't say anything to me, right? He just squished into the back. And I drove him back to the Rabat, and I think he picked up on the vibe already that something was wrong. He got out of the car, took his little suitcase, a little case that he had, and he went in there, and he didn't invite me in. That was it. And that was the end of that, right? And alhamdulillah, I didn't get arrested or anything like that. Now, to top it off, I roll the film let's see, how many years? Let's say it was to 82 or 83, I think it was. Sheikh Abdul Qadir came to visit Sheikh Fadlallah at Beit Din, and I was serving them tea. And Sheikh Fadlallah said, I'd like you to take Sheikh Abdul Qadir to his hotel where he's staying. And at that time I had a more or less decent car. And I waited for Sheikh Abdul Qadir outside, and I opened the door for him. And he walked up, and just before he got in the car, he looked at me and said, "This is your car, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." And he got in, and I drove him to the hotel. So that's one of the most, really a wonderful story. How much time do we have? A little bit more? Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to tell one more. Yesterday we saw a picture of Sheikh Bashir Uthman Bashir. He's a wonderful being. This is a man, his history actually is being written now, and I've just learned some things I never knew about him. Because if you met him, you know, he lived in Medina, he had beautiful children there, and he was originally from, I believe it was Ethiopia or Eritrea. He was Eritrea. And he always appeared to be this very humble, he was very humble, faqir, but he was a great alim, he was an arif, and one of the inheritors of from a sheikh called Sheikh Bukhari from Medina, who was an incredible being, and that's another story also. I had met him in Medina. So it seemed like every time I came to London, Sheikh Bashir would also be there and staying. We had at that time, this was somewhere in the late 80s, I think. We had a place in, I can't remember the street, Ossington Street. Yeah, right between Queensway and Notting Hill Gate, across from Kensington Gardens. Lovely place, multi-leveled, and Sheikh Fadlallah used it as a library, as a center for publishing. We had many scholars came there and sat with Sheikh Fadlallah. Bahar Aloom was there many times, Sayyid Mehdi Hakim, Sheikh Nazim came to see him, Sheikh Asif came to see him. It was really a happening place there. And Sheikh Bashir used to come, and it seemed like, again, every time I was in London, he would show up and I would then look after him. So one day he arrived, and he used to be he was very humble, and he would bring his own coffee pots, and because he made this Eritrean coffee, bring his own coffee. They would chew, chat, and he'd have his Eritrean friends come up, and they would gather together, and they would do wazifa, they would do dhikr. It was wonderful to be around him. Anyway, on one of these occasions, he arrived, and on the same day that he arrives, he receives an invitation from Morocco to attend a wedding of one of his murid's sons. Now, for those of you who know anything about English immigration and visas, here's a man, Sheikh Bashir, who came from Saudi Arabia. He had a visa to come into London, a single entry visa, and now he wants to go to Morocco and come back to London. So I knew about these things, and I said, well, I don't think you'll be able to do that. He said, no. He says, no. He says, go. He said, to Croydon. You know, now in Croydon is the immigration center where you get visas, right? So he gave me his passport, and now that was already not a good idea because I'm not him, right? But he, but this is what he said. He said, take my visa, take my passport and go to the Croydon Center and get me a multiple entry visa. Right, I'll do it right away, right? So I got on a taxi and a bus, and I made it all the way down to Croydon. It took me an hour or so to get down there from London. And if any of you have ever been to this place in Croydon, it is a lot of seating area, an open air, and people from India and other places they've got cloths on the ground laying around. People are waiting in line for hours and hours just to process visas. And there's a big lit number system where they pull a chain and they go, 12, 13, and they give you little tickets. So I got my ticket and I waited. Finally, after some hours, it was early in the morning, some hours passed, and I got my ticket and I walked up to the guy. And I said, this is my friend's passport, and he's quite old, and he wants to go to Morocco, and he needs a multiple entry visa. The guy looked at me like I was completely out of my mind. He said, you can't be here, you can't have his passport, we don't do this. He can only get a multiple entry from his own country. He can only, the single entry is valid for him, and nothing else will happen, nothing. And so I tried to convince him. I said, can you just do this? It's really important. And of course, he's heard how many stories has he heard people say this all day long. So he gave me back the passport. He said, you shouldn't, and he also warned me, he said, you shouldn't have this passport. You should take it back and give it to this person and have him go through the proper channels. So I went back to London, went to the center, and I met with Sheikh Bashir. And I told him what happened. And he said, okay. Then he had a tasbih around his neck. He took it off and he gave it to me. And he said, from this moment on, I want you to say, Ya Saghiru Ya Karibu. Ya Saghiru Ya Karibu. I believe it means you who quicken and you who bring near. And say it, he said, the entire time that you're going from here back to Croydon, right? I said, okay. So it was a big tasbih, and so I started to say, Ya Saghiru Ya Karibu, Ya Saghiru Ya Karibu, all the way down to Croydon. I get to Croydon, and I'm back in the same scene, right? People laying around. The number was really low. I guess they turned over a couple of times. I took a number, and my number was probably 50 or 60 people, numbers, ahead or before me. So I sat there, and he was just in like about 20 meters from me, behind the desk, the guy who I originally had met the first time. So I'm sitting there doing this dhikr, Ya Saghiru Ya Karib, and I'm just looking at him. Yeah, it was menacing, I guess. It was Ya Saghiru Ya Karib, Ya Saghiru Ya Karib. And I just, all of a sudden, I felt like everything started to disappear around me. And I just held this like tunnel of vision of this man and me, and this dhikr going on. And it was a visual, and it was visceral. I could feel it, this whole experience. All of a sudden, he pulls the string for the next number. He calls it out, number 12. Nobody shows up. Number 13. Nobody shows up. And like 14, 15. He's going through the numbers, right? Nobody's showing up. I was completely awestruck. The guy was completely awestruck. That never happens. People don't leave their place in line. He went through one number after another number, and then until he got to my number, right? I walked up. I was shaking. He was pale. I said, "Do you remember me?" Right? Allah. He said, "Yeah." I said, "I told you about this man." Right? I said, "He's a special being." I handed him the passport. I said, "You saw what happened. You need to do something about this." So he said, in a very sort of trembling way, he said, "Okay." He said, "Just 1 minute." He said, "I need to take a moment out." Can I get some water? Oh, yes. Excuse me, I'm feeling a bit dizzy now telling this story. It was quite a moment, really, that day. So he takes the passport and he goes into the office behind him, and about 20 minutes passes, and he comes around and he says, "I have never, ever seen anything like this happen before." He said, "My supervisor, I told the story to my supervisor, and he was so touched by it, and he gave a multiple entry visa to stamped it right there and encroided in the passport, and he handed it back to me, and he said something to the effect of, "I hope I never see you again." Right? It's complete. So I was really in shock, but yet at the same time I was overflowing with that sense that Allah's decree is beyond our ability to fathom. That you can't know, you think you know, you think you have a rational view of the life, and you have to. I mean, you have to approach things in a rational way, how things work and so on. But you always, also at the same time, there's another X factor that takes place, an angelic and a factor of Allah's I can't say interference because Allah's the only actor anyway. But it's just, you recognize it. You wake up to that reality. So holding the passport, I'm still not even believing that I have it in my hand. And I walk out, and in front of Croydon, the center in Croydon is a brick area that leads out to the street where the buses are. And I'm walking out to go to the bus shelter, and a little Morris Minor pulls up, filled with Eritrean people, right? And the little back door opens. I mean, there was like 6 people in this tiny Morris Minor. And I look inside, it's Sheikh Bashir. And he drove down, he looked in the car, he said, da. And I got in the car, and I handed him the passport. He was packed already, right? And he was on the way to the airport. He just came to pick up the passport. And I squashed into the car with them, and I was sitting next to Sheikh Bashir, and Sheikh Bashir is very tall. He's 6'3", but he's thin as a rake. And I was squishing him up against the door, and I started to explain to him what happened, and he just said, Allah, that's it. He said, don't. He knew. I mean, he had that basira that Allah showed him, because he was right there. And we drove to the airport. And he got his ticket to Morocco, and he left, and alhamdulillah, he came back after he attended the wedding. So this is, Sheikh Bashir. Now, Sheikh Bashir, I want to tell you a little bit about him, which I've just learned, which I didn't know at all. I don't know if Sheikh Bashir Uthman was a very wealthy Eritrean. He owned a newspaper and several other newspapers. He had a big daily plus small gazettes. And he was a very wealthy man, and how he met his sheikh was that Sheikh Bukhari was traveling around East Africa and giving talks and meeting Sufis in many different places, and he came to his town. And Sheikh Bashir Uthman Bashir had sent one of his reporters to a venue to where the sheikh was. And the sheikh wouldn't receive the reporter, and Sheikh Bashir was slightly offended by that, because he had the #1 newspaper in Eritrea, and this was an event he thought that the sheikh would utilize to promote himself. He'd put him in the paper and so on, but the sheikh just blew it off. He didn't want to be interviewed. So he learned from his reporter that the sheikh had gotten in his car, and they were driving in caravan with a few other cars. They were going toward the border of Ethiopia. So he got so upset, he got in his car. And he told me, I was told by one of his relatives, that it was quite a fancy Mercedes, and he knew the highway that Sheikh Bukhari was traveling, and he said, okay, I'm going to go give him a piece of my mind. So he drove out and he chased him down the highway, and finally he found him. They pulled the cars over, and he knocked on Sheikh Bukhari's window, and Sheikh Bukhari rolled down the window, and he said, Sheikh Bashir said to him, I provided you with a possibility, it was rude for you to treat me this way, right? And Sheikh Bukhari looked at him and said, you haven't done anything for your own life, you haven't promoted your true self, let alone anything else. He said, if you want to have any kind of salvation for truth, leave your car, leave your business, leave everything, and get in this car and come with me right now. Right? He did. He got in that car. He was just completely shattered. You know, he got in the car, drove off with Sheikh Bukhari. He didn't return back to Eritrea for some years. It turned out that his brother and his wife and someone else took over the running of the newspaper. He didn't leave it in shambles, but he, as a personal movement of his life, of an expansion in his life, he recognized immediately what the Sheikh was trying to tell him, and he took off. And he wound up going to Eritrea, to Ethiopia, and eventually winding up in Medina al-Munawwara, where he was finally buried. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how he was buried, because it's quite an amazing story. When he passed away, and I heard this from his wife, when he passed away, 4 young men came to take his body at night. They wanted to do the Salat al-Janaza and the washing of his body and everything at night. And his wife said that they were 4 men around their 30s, all beautiful looking, with bare feet and just white robes, right? And they took him at night, and they did the ghusl. They put him in his kafin, and they took him at night to Jannat al-Baqi and buried him in Jannat al-Baqi. And the next day, the family went out. Everybody went out to see the burial, or they went that evening. I'm a bit fuzzy on this whole part of the story, but it turned out that these 4 men, they'd never seen them before. They never saw them again. When they went outside to look, they said there was no indication that they came to the house, no footprints, nothing in the sand that was in front of their house. Yet he wound up in Jannat al-Baqi, and the word got out into Medina that Sheikh Bashir Uthman was buried in Jannat al-Baqi, and officials of the Saudi government came and said, well, that grave was for somebody else, and he shouldn't have been there, but I'm not sure if all the other bureaucratic things happened, but they allowed it because he was already there, and they made some kind of decision to that. And that's how he wound up in Jannat al-Baqi. At night, somehow, by 4 strangers that nobody knew and never ever saw again, there. That's it.
Thank you.
Is that it? Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum.
Can I mention your book?
Do you have a question?
Yes, Hajj.
Yeah.
I know the answer is going to be yes, but I have to ask it anyway.
Okay.
Can I please have that cheap plastic mangy plant?
I don't have it anymore. I gave it to someone else, actually. Somebody asked me for it when they heard it, for the barakah.
Before he died, he came to Pakistan. The story continues. Mullah and I were living in Pakistan at the time. And when he came, off and on, he'd been a little bit unwell.
Yeah, that's right.
But there's something very amazing about this being. And Sheikh Bashir coming to Pakistan, wow, it was wonderful. But he wanted to go to a particular part of the city in Karachi where you can buy all of these sometimes borderline legal sort of products. So he bought opium and then he bought some of this. But then he wanted to buy cyanide. You may laugh, but it's illegal.
But he was a hakim.
Yeah, that has to be said.
Bashir Uthman, one of the things that Haji Mustafa can tell you a lot more about is that he spent 7 years traveling in the wilderness in Ethiopia and Eritrea. And so he knew all the herbs, he knew all the treatments. But he realized that after all those 7 years of travel, that the entire sort of treatment that he used to give, the most important was actually the Surah Al-Fatiha. And of the Al-Fatiha, he used to say, Bismillah is the most important thing for me. And he often would just treat with that. Anyway, he's in Pakistan and he says, look, I've come here, this is my last trip. I'm not going to live much longer. And I've come here for some medication before I pass on. So cyanide, opium, and God knows what else. And I said, how the hell is he going to travel out of Pakistan with all of this? And remember, Pakistan is very, very, at least at the airports, they're very, very strict on security and they check all of the stuff that you're carrying. They have sniffer dogs, etc., etc. But Sheikh Bashir had given us a particular prayer, which if you did that, and you would basically be able to do anything. You would walk through immigration, nobody would bother you, etc. And he said, no, you'll be fine. And sure enough, he was carrying God knows how much stuff, and he was just wearing this long, you remember he used to have this long
jacket, grey coat, yeah.
And he had lots of pockets in that. So he had stuffed all that stuff in there. And he didn't have anything other than this little bag. Like I say, the crown kind of a bag. So he gets to the immigration, and Zaram tells me this bit because Dr. Zaram was with him, taking him through the immigration. And Zaram is, he's kind of a cool guy, but I mean, even he was being a bit nervous, sort of thing, that if I caught, there'll be a little trouble. Anyway, he sort of said the she sort of just did the dua, MashaAllah, 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 yes, Rasooli, MashaAllah, MashaAllah, MashaAllah. He walked up to the immigration guy. The immigration guy didn't sort of do anything, he stamped it. He'd already gone through the customs people, the sniffer dogs, nothing had happened. He got on the aircraft and went off. After that Hajj, about 3 weeks later, he passed away. So he had already planned whatever he was going to be doing. But this is this last story of Shaykh Islam. But I wanted to share that because that was the last time we met him. The one other thing was God, the most awful sort of food. At the Saudi embassy, you remember he had some morids. Food. That was the last thing that he would do. He didn't like food. He barely ate. But mashallah, I did.
Is my microphone still on? I'll just share another little story about Sheikh Bashir. You know, when you talk about someone like that, you feel his presence. You can evoke. He was a great being, really. He was. I remember, there's a description of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam that whenever he walked quickly and he walked kind of leaning forward. That's how Sheikh Bashir Uthman walked. He walked fast as though he was walking up a hill. He was always walking, and he'd always not be disturbed or distracted by anything around him. I often would walk in London with him. He would hold me close to him, like my arm would be under his arm, and he would point out to me around the streets of London who was possessed by jinn. And nearly was half the people in London. I mean, he literally would say, the jinn. He was saying people are so void of dhikr and of any kind of spirituality that they make good homes for malevolent energies and things like jinn. But one of these times that I was at the Ossington Center with Sheikh Bashir, every day he would retire to his room, and I know he would take him about 35 minutes. I would hear him because I had the room next door. I could hear sort of sounds carrying on. I didn't know quite what he was doing, but I would prepare every morning breakfast for him. He had the same thing every morning. It was a fried egg and one slice of toast and a cup of tea. And one of these mornings, I went up to give him his breakfast and knocked at his door, and there was no answer. And I knew he was older, and I thought he could easily have passed away. So I took the liberty and I opened the door, and I saw him lying on his bed with the white sheet over his head like he was dead. Right? It looked, was completely still. And I was very upset. I thought he had died overnight. So I walked up to him and I put the tray down and I pulled the sheet over it from his head, and he was wrapped in his kafin. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't quite the traditional wrap that you would wrap a dead body, but it was pretty much wrapped around his neck and around the back of his head. And I'm thinking, I'm not quite know what to think about this. Is he dead? He died in the middle of the night. Other people came and put a kafin on him. I just couldn't feel. And then I noticed also he had a 10,000 bead tasbih, right? And it was around his whole body. He was wrapped in this tasbih. And I'm looking at him and I'm just about to tear up, and all of a sudden his eyes open up, right? Right? And he looks at me and he goes, "MashaAllah," right? And I go, "Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh." I said, "Hey, Shaila, what's, Ma'ala?" And he said, "Stanish way," and he said, "Wait." So I left the room and I came back, he came downstairs, and I brought his tray down, he had breakfast with me downstairs, and he explained to me, this incredible being, before he goes to sleep every night, he does, for his own self, he does a ghusl of mayat, he does the ghusl of death. He puts on a kafin, right, for himself, and he goes to bed with a tasbih of 10,000 beads. And he says that if he should pass away in the night, he said, this is how I want to go, like this. And so that was his habit, to do that. And he said, you're the only, well, not many people know, but he said he hid it from people, he said nobody knows, and he told me not to tell anybody. Of course I told everybody, but after he passed away. Let's say a Fatiha for Sheikh Bashir Ahmad. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين. Actually, I'd be remiss if I didn't say this last thing. Sheikh Bashir left behind one dua, which he said to us to give to anybody who would do it. And it's the last 10 ayahs of Surah Al-Hashr. Last four ayahs of Surah Al-Hashr. لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبال ورأيت, that one. And that you take your thumb and your middle finger and put it here on your head, as where you would, if you had horns, you'd have horns. And after your Fajr and Maghrib Salat, to say it all the way through, and then at the end say a salawat on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said that if you do that every single day, it will ward off illness, and it'll ward off illness. And you would not die from an accident. That's right. There were some other things for protection. Yes, for protection. So it's so if you have the himma, the enthusiasm, and connect with it, it's a really good thing to do. And that's an incredible, that ayat for reflection, that majestic teaching, if it's only that can be realized and embodied in the human being, is an incredible thing to say every day, twice a day. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, for these wonderful stories. If I didn't know you, if I didn't see you in front of me, I don't think I'd believe it. It's so amazing stories. Really. They really put all our understanding and conception of how the world works at its head, on its head. It's really challenging to our rationality to hear these stories, and I think it's very good for us. I think it's very healthy for us. I think it really enables us to put things in perspective. These stories are not meant to lead to some kind of hero worship, some kind of personal cult. They're just meant to make us realize that there is much, much more to life than meets the eye. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who has attended this wonderful gathering, this Ask conference here at the Rasooli Center. It's been such a joy to be here and to be, in a very small respect, part of arranging the program, etc. Really is the people here on the ground who do all the work. We just do the talking and a little bit of the, I don't know, you can say, walking or flying. Actually, we didn't even walk. But the work has been done by these fantastic people here who work at the Rasooli Center, and all these wonderful people who have volunteered and does such an enormous amount of work, and I'm sure some people have spent some of the money, and may they gain the greatest reward, and let this be a source for a blessing for them and for their families, for everybody who attended, and for everybody else. Really, I'm so joyed, I'm so moved. It's such a fantastic experience. We have had our retreats on the west coast of Sweden, and that has been very special as well. And this is just mind-blowing. I cannot say that's maybe the best term. It's just really blows the mind. So thank you so much, everybody. I'm so happy that we could all attend this. I'm so happy that this went so fantastically well, as wonderfully as it did. All these fantastic talks we have listened to, and all these fantastic meetings that have been going on between and in and on the program. So many people have met so many other people that I'm sure have meant a lot to them and who they will remember for the rest of their lives. I certainly will. So thank you so much, everybody, and I think we should all together just express our gratitude to everybody, and of course to Allah. But as the Prophet says, "Man la yashkuri nas, la yashkuri Allah." Who doesn't thank the people, he doesn't thank the Lord. So if you want to show gratitude to Allah, we also show gratitude to everybody else. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Allah, thank you, God, for giving us this opportunity, and let's all sort of seal this event together with the Fatiha. For everybody who we talked about, everybody sort of who has been mentioned here, and all of those who have not been mentioned, for ourselves, for the center, and for the goodness of all of mankind, for all mankind. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام